data that can be used to monitor and implement in a systematic way safety across various departments, but also with various stakeholders in play. Our end game is the co-production of safety for all, which means a local governance or safety framework that participates in not just benchmarking, but holding actors accountable in the delivery of safety in cities. Local government is understood as a key coordinator. We're moving just from talking about safe to safer because we believe that each and every city, each and every neighborhood aspires a safer construct based on the types of crime and violence they are dealing with. And in this process, we are looking at how we understand the problem of lack of data, to how we assess the current data being collected, identify the effective strategies to strengthen municipal data collection. We share the practical lessons of translation of data into policy, and finally propose a type of KPIs that can take this work forward. So I would not want to belabor the point, but to conclude by saying we are now at a stage of looking at cities as laboratories. And so as we look at Joburg and Durban, we are also now approaching them as laboratories of knowledge that already exists, but also to help facilitate learning between us and amongst us to be able to draw out the innovations that can then facilitate the integrated solutions that the 2030 agenda and the new urban agenda speak to. So I think having situated that conversation as such, you and have convening an expert group meeting that will in itself be able to start the process of shortlisting a long set of indicators with really the construct of urban safety in mind. There has been, of course, an evolution of safer cities over the past 2 decades as prevention became more institutionalized within the rank and file of local governments. There has been a shift of language and the narrative from just crime and violence prevention to urban safety, and which embraces more wider aspects of understanding not just the incidences of crime and violence, but also the way we perceive safety. Ultimately, also, it's about how we enhance a more meaningful participation of citizenry in accessing the benefits of city life and in championing the rights of each citizen to the construct of the city. So I think that I shouldn't belabor the point any further, but to now bring on board, I believe, do I have Nomusa and Nazira online?
Can you? Okay, all right, great.
Barbara, I can hear you speak. Nazira, Nomusa, can any one of you indicate your presence in this setting?
Yes, I'm in Nomusa.
Nomusa.
Okay, can you guys hear me?
Very well, Nazira. I can hear you too. Yeah, welcome on board. I think it does a lot of justice to the audience to bring this Safer Cities approach and discussion closer to the heart of how cities are actually implementing this narrative and how they are translating them into the metrics to monitor the way they implement. So perhaps I could start with Nazira. I think we have journeyed a long way with you over 2 decades. And perhaps I have seen a lot of innovation in the city of Johannesburg connecting safety with its broadest city vision 2020, then to the GDS 2040. And around that, there has been a lot of discussion around metrics, which I think I have not seen in any other city more than what your city has actually shown. So perhaps maybe you could start by giving us an idea about how the city interprets its mandate for the safety as a whole, and then for the safety of children.
Thanks, Chuma. So I think just to contextualize safety within the broader sort of agenda of the city, as you are aware, the city does have a safety strategy, and that strategy is really embedded in its long-term sort of growth and development strategy. And I think in that context, it's important to perhaps share with people who perhaps haven't really engaged with the city's long-term vision for a while. But I think in the conversation that we're having, it's important to understand that I think institutionally there are opportunities in the conversation that we're going to have of, I think, further kind of promoting and entrenching the idea of children's safety. So the city is really kind of has a long-term vision for safety, and it's built into its outcomes. And I think it's important just to perhaps share those strategic outcomes, because they really speak to the conversations we've been having today. And the first outcome is really improved quality of life and development-driven resilience for all. And I think that in that particular context, the outcome really focuses on the development of social health and safety conditions in the city. The link to that outcome then is to address poverty, food security, healthy living, and a safe and secure city, social cohesion and social inclusivity. So I think all the right language and all the right dimensions are in this long-term visioning of the city. Linked to that outcome is also building resilient and livable, sustainable urban environments. And I think here there's also an important link to the conversation around children's safety. Then there's focus on job-intensive and a resilient economy, and a focus on governance. And here it's really about a participative, citizen-based approach to how we're developing policy and engaging communities. So I think the sort of framework is built around the idea that we can start focusing on a more integrated approach to how we see city development, and safety is very much part of that conversation. And so safety is defined broadly and both subjectively and objectively in terms of incorporating the physical environment, social processes, perceptions and experience of safety, and the fear of crime and victimization. So those are important starting points for some of the work that the city then has been doing and is still doing. There is a focus on vulnerable residents, and I think children are focused very much in the GDS conversation, in the narrative, when it comes to how we address some of those concerns. And then community safety also goes beyond crime. I think we've included traffic safety, fire, environmental hazards, deprivation, family systems, community networks. And interestingly enough, in a large city like Johannesburg, the idea of including things like drowning and burns, which has been neglected. And so the idea then is, within this GDS approach, is to have a clustered approach.
Because I can't be bothered to like.
Lois, can you mute your phone, please? Sorry, Nazira. Please go ahead.
That's fine. So the city has a clustered approach to how it's dealing with these objectives, and the human and social development cluster is where safety sits. And so there is this integrated idea and approach to how you know, the city wants to deal with safety in a more collaborative and intersectoral approach. We'll talk about some of the challenges, I think, about institutional approaches that kind of look at safety, but I think I just want to first contextualize the focus, and then we can talk about some of the institutional challenges, I think, that promoting the idea of an integrated safety approach brings about. And I think you spoke a lot about data. It's one of the key issues that we want to focus on. So just to share that the current projects that the city is focusing on, and through my office, we're developing a city safety index. And so the idea really here is to have a common set of safety and crime-related indicators that is understood by all and can assist the city to effectively and accurately report on the state of safety and crime. So that is something that we've sort of started this approach a while back, but as priorities change, focus change. So the city is sort of at, I think, Musa will agree with me, we kind of stop and start with a lot of critical projects, and we have to kind of reinvent the wheel sometimes. But this is a critical sort of focus. So this city safety index, the idea then is to promote a safety observatory. The city has an integrated operations center, and our vision is really to have the safety observatory really track and monitor the safety index. Built into that, we're also developing a tool to really review projects post-implementation, because I think we have learned over the years that there's a lot of very interesting and innovative projects that the city implements on the ground. But I think after a couple of years, you're not seeing any evaluative impacts about that particular upgrade or project on safety in particular. So we want to begin to track the impact of some of the projects that the city really implements in the built environment, particularly on safety. I think another sort of approach that we're taking in this financial year is also to begin a conversation across the different departments, specifically focused on how we're going to track indicators on safety. So through the cluster approach, we're going to have a forum where we would be having conversations on a quarterly basis with city departments, and also linking to provincial projects on how we begin to track our impact on particularly projects that have a safety focus. So that's really what I'm focusing on in particular, but then just to very quickly touch on broader city approaches to child safety indicators. And here we are looking at a very sort of focused approach for child safety when it comes to early childhood development in the city. So there we see social development focusing on early childhood, and built into that program and projects are parenting skills. These are interventions that are also linked then to health and care programs and child protection activities. So that's something that is built into these programs. Then there's a focus on children between the ages of 1 and 18 years old. And this focus is also, I think, included more around activities. So there's a focus on arts and culture, sports and recreation. The libraries are also quite involved with some of these projects and programs. And again, there's a health program focus for this age group. For another sort of focused program for 9 to 18 years, there's also a focus more on what they call the computer clubhouse. And here they are looking at programs that look at graphic designing, music production, computer programming, And these are and holiday programs. So they're based around the sort of regions and very localized projects and programs. And then the city also has, through its emergency management department, something called a Be Safe Center. And here, all new fire stations that will be built around the city and those that exist already have a Be Safe Center. And here, this is really focused around promoting children's safety, particularly in vulnerable sort of communities such as the informal settlements. So that focus is there. And then I think broadly, we also part of the Urban Safety Reference Group. And here we, with the Urban Safety Reference Group across all the metros, we're also looking at 21 safety indicators. And here these indicators also focus on objective indicators that are directly linked to safety, subjective indicators that are linked to the experience of crime, feelings of safety, and then socioeconomic indicators. And here it's really looking at issues around population growth, density, social incoherence linked to family issues. So there's a sort of broader focus around including safety indicators. And the city also then has what it's called a public safety index. This index really tracks perceptions of citizens through a customer satisfaction survey. So the very dedicated sort of questionnaire around how people feel about safety at night, safety in parks, safety in public open spaces. So those are some of the sort of ways in which I think the indicators begin to speak to a broader sort of idea of where the city wants to go. But I think what is interesting, I think more the conversation is about the institutional challenges with an approach like that. So I don't know if you want to have that conversation around where we begin to, I see challenges within city sort of metros, and then maybe look at how we begin to think about, I think, making the conversation a lot more complex about where we want to then begin to approach indicators for safety in terms of the way in which sort of a wide, broad, good approach.
I'm losing you, Nazira.
So end of that, we may hear me.
I can hear you now. Yes, I can hear you now.
Can you hear me? Okay, you're freezing,
Yes.
so I don't know if it's on your side or my side.
Oh.
So I think we begin to sort of have the conversation around some of the ways in which cities then facing internal sort of challenges around approaching safety indicators in a more technocratic way, where you're actually seeing, sort of number-based, we look at targets, and people are sort of looking at the way in which we measure the indicators, rather than really understanding the complexities of how we want to look at the impact of safety and what we actually want to achieve as an outcome, rather than reduction in, say, a number of drownings or reduction in the number of fire hazards. So I think those are some of your sort of tools that we could be addressing in terms of how we're dealing with a question of institutionalizing mechanisms that don't just look at indicators from a really sort of technocratic point of view, but make them real, make them lived experience. And we need to have a conversation about how we complexify the sort of urban indicators a little more than just looking at an end sort of numbers results. So I'm going to leave it at that for now, and then we could kind of listen to Nomusa and continue the conversation. Okay.
Awesome, Nazira. As always, you know, I keep giving this as a reference in many global conversations that if you really want to look at a laboratory that really has done extensive work on this metrics issue, go to Johannesburg. And if Johannesburg is not going to get it right, then no one else will get it right. I really like the idea that you look at the way the institutional aspect, which I think is at the core of the blockage. And when we all just simply focus on reduction, which is of course also the I may not use the word mistake, but the obvious reality that the 2030 agenda for sustainable development has taken in terms of the indicators that focus on crime and violence. So we are held in this hostage scenario where we are all talking now about how to reduce the levels of urban violence by 50% by the year 2030. And with nothing else to hold, it means this kind of practical experiences of cities like Johannesburg will need to be brought more to the fore. And I think that's part of what the 40-day Safer Cities Challenge is trying to do, is trying to make people know that cities have a story to say, and they are actually changing the narrative to a more outcome based, as you call it, lived experience, as opposed to just simply the technocratic way. Now, with that in mind, maybe a comparative experience now from Durban. I know Durban, Nomusa, your institutional setting of safety varies from that of Johannesburg. And perhaps you may want to start by explaining that particular aspect of how safety is institutionalized and what type of transformation is going on at the moment to move the institutional setting to a much broader outlook of safety. And maybe then you could then speak to how this mandate of safety now relates to children. How does it really get measured and monitored, enabled in what you may define as area-based management frameworks? Nomusa.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you loud and clear.
Okay. Thanks, Juma, and thanks to everyone. Within equity, we are structured in such a way that the city, according to its institutional setting, we, as Safer Cities, there is a unit that sits within Community and Emergency Services Cluster, which reports directly to the city manager. And within that context, all the safety and social services are together, which makes it a bit easier to navigate the processes around how we implement and how we structure strategically as a city. So within the context of Community and Emergency Services Cluster, we have a range of, I would say, units. And amongst those, when we consider that the framework of a safer city talks to the law enforcement element, it also talks to the social crime prevention element, and also around the urban development. That's the urban development framework does not necessarily sit within our cluster though, but the two, which are critical as well, makes it quite easy to navigate the processes around the safer cities and and also the safety of children. I need to mention that we are guided by the long-term development framework, which talks to one of the areas is creating a safe city. And the other part to that is promoting an accessible city, as well as sustainable livelihoods, and also celebrating the cultural diversity, which we've talked about earlier. I think the earlier discussion was very relevant around this particular area of work that we are doing as well. But over and above that, our safer city strategy talks to 5 elements, and those elements are normally around the issues of integrated knowledge management. And within that context, we are able to galvanize, support, and galvanize all the stakeholders to talk with one voice, to say that safety is not just for one department or one unit, but safety is for all. And therefore, we are creating a laboratory where everyone should contribute to that space to ensure that the safety agenda transverses along all the clusters, along all the departments, and along all the units. And we have adopted the transversal management approach as a city to ensure that such issues and the pilot around the transversal management is around the safety. So in other words, all departments now have a role to play and have understanding, a better understanding. Although not enough capacity has been provided to all those units and departments who do not see themselves as contributing to the safety agenda, but that is the program that we are undertaking as a city. Within that content of our safer city strategy, we also talk about the social crime prevention itself, which relates directly to how do we see children in the space and how do they see themselves as urban citizens. And of course, working with the various other departments, internally and externally, from local as well as provincial departments. The social crime prevention is actually one of the key elements that we are focusing on, and even the promotion of art and culture falls within that particular context. And we are working on ensuring that this is understood by the various units who have understood that safety is an element of policing rather than the issue of urban safety, which brings everybody together. Within also that strategy, we also talk about the safe built environment. And the safe built environment, that's where we bring up on board our urban planners, our designers, and they are then able, through the various principles of crime prevention through environmental design, to think about safety as they design, as they develop, as they plan. But more importantly is that we are working with our Treasury Department to start seeing safety as a project that requires transversal budgeting. And when we talk about transversal budgeting, we talk about every other department ensuring that within their planning, their programming, they do have an element of safety being budgeted for. That means that even the urban planners, even the social partners within the city are able to see the value that they can contribute towards safety directly or indirectly. But over and above that, we have our social development strategy, which has been adopted by the city. And it sits within this cluster, which is Community and Emergency Services Cluster, which is making it possible, if I may say, for a range of other units and clusters that are not necessarily within the space of community and emergency to talk about social development in its totality. When we talk about social development, with issues of social health are brought on board, issues of social policing are brought on board, facilities development, social facilities development, as well as infrastructure that relates to our human sentiments is also taken into account within that particular strategy. So in other words, these pillars or these strategies are navigating how we should be operating as a city in a way that talks to the issues of safety. But I think we need to understand that when we talk about the indicators of safety within our city, we are talking about how do we protect our children in particular within the public space, and how do we protect our children in the home environment, and how do we ensure that the children are protected by the institutions or within the institutions. That's one, that's about protection. But we also need to ensure that part of some of these indicators need to look at making, how do we make children happy? What indicators should we bring on board that will ensure that our children are happy? Because they may be on the public space, but you are not sure whether they are happy within that public space. They may be at home, but you are not sure whether they are happy within that home. So how do you ensure that children are able to play, they're able to laugh, and they're able to be creative? In that sense, you'll be able to measure that the children have, in terms of the whole context of safety, they are able to, they are self-actualized, they are able to develop optimally, and they're able to achieve their aspirations as children. So those are the areas that I think we need to consider when we talk about our indicators. But as we are all aware that the protection of children is a mandate sits within the social development arena, which is a national and a provincial mandate. But as cities, we have identified the gaps that are not, the gray areas that these departments or these national and provincial departments are not able to fill. And as City of eThekwini, we had initially provided some funding relating to those gaps that we have identified, so that we are able to identify even within our stakeholders within the NGO sector to fund those initiatives that we see that they are not being provided for by the national or provincial department. Also, we're looking at ensuring that our policies and our programs and our projects do speak to the issues of children. And we have a policy in place which is talking to the children per se. It sits within the vulnerable groups sector. And that is one of the units. There is one unit within the eThekwini that deals with vulnerable groups. So there is a policy that speaks to issues of children. And within that framework, we are able to identify the roles and responsibilities of many other departments that are within the city and outside the city that should contribute to the policy implementation. And with that, we are able also to fund the number of NGOs in relation to the ECD development, as well as providing granting aid funding for those. In other words, the matters of children are getting prominence. But over and above that, what is interesting is that the urban planning unit within the development planning, they've identified also the gaps in terms of in terms of spatial development framework, that when they are designs that are done around the pathways and the designs are done around the sidewalks, they do not consider the fact that there are mothers that will have to push prams for their children, with children, or have children over and above the pram but they have children that are going along with them. So the narrowness of the sidewalks have been reconsidered to reconfigure the fact that there are these particular groups of people which are critical in the space that need to be considered. So I just have to end there, but over and above that, we do consider the fact that it's not only the children that I would say fall within the normal scope of being a child, but there are children that are also disabled. And the city has actually developed or established a program that is able to address those matters. In one instance, the city has purchased buses that are disabled friendly, and they are able to, it's called a dial ride, and you are able to dial that ride for a child that needs to go to school but is unable to go to school because of his or her disability. So those are the interventions that the city has undertaken to ensure that matters of safety are considered. But it's important that we also galvanize support in terms of ensuring that the indicators that you are talking about, they are able to be monitored, and they also, we do have a measure of impact, which is the social impact around them. So I think I'll end there and take further.
Okay, thank you very much, Nomusa, as much as Nazira also. I think what you both have succinctly put forward is given us a perspective of the mandate of local government and how it articulates the city metrics that speak to the safety of children. I think you definitely clearly show that the cities are grappling with this idea, not just of children's safety, but safety as a whole, as a city's responsibility, as we speak to the different sets of indicators that you find in different pockets of the city. Now, I think before I can hand it over to the next presenter, perhaps I could throw back to both of you maybe. If does anyone, Nazira, do you have a particular question for Nomusa based on the clarity and practicality and purpose of the types of indicators that she is raising and institutional approaches? Likewise, Nomusa, do you have something particular that you may want to have clarified in the perspective of what Nazira did mention? Does any one of you have a particular burning commentary or question at this point of time?
Just from my side, I think key question always is, so I think Nomusa's also got an institutional environment where there's a lot happening, and it's happening in quite a sort of robust way in different pockets. But I think the key challenge, and I'm not sure how eThekwini deals with it, is where is all of this sort of central repository of information and data actually being captured, and how does it get sort of the impact of a lot of the work that is being done? How does eThekwini actually do that? Who's measuring, and what kind of indicators do they then use for performance to measure a lot of the things that Nomusa has also mentioned? Those are our internal challenges, I think, as Johannesburg, because we're very siloed in how we measure departmental input and how we do things on these safety related projects. So although they are clustered, they are transversal, the measurement is really very departmental. And so at the end of the day, the impact and what you're measuring is really not felt, and you really break down the whole purpose of an outcome of an important indicator, say on child safety, linked to a particular focused area, because you're asking a department to give a measurement on their particular performance. So those are some of the sort of, I think, institutional challenges around measuring indicators and how we need to think about how best to institutionalize how we want to measure indicators, who measures them, where should it sit? Is it the city manager? Is it a dedicated project focus? I think those are conversations that differ from city to city, and I'm not sure how Namusa and them deal with that issue.
I think, Nazira, this has been a very difficult one in the past, and I think now with our new strategy, the reviewed strategy, we are in the process of ensuring that we bring everybody on board. And it is actually forcing people to understand safety in its context and the different roles that the various units and departments are playing, directly or indirectly. We have the transversal management approach that is being supported by the city via the World Bank, which is actually helping us to galvanize the support from the various stakeholders, from the various units. And it has actually assisted us in the sense that we are now talking in one voice. And when you talk about safety, it's no longer a policing matter, because that was the journey that we needed to take with our internal departments or units. That safety is not only the matter of policing, but it's a matter for everyone. So that understanding is slowly getting into the spheres of various institutions internally. But what is also interesting is that we have a set of indicators that are being developed through the performance and monitoring unit, working together with the Department of the Treasury. In terms of that, we noted that the safety measures, the safety indicators were not present in the circular 88. They were not there. And we have to make a lot of noise to say, if we want the safety to be, because we all understand that safety is an issue that is actually bringing a lot of discomfort to most communities. And if that is not present, how then do we ensure that everyone is actually supporting the safety agenda within our cities? However, it was understood that safety, even at that level, is a competency for national and provincial government, not necessarily local government matter. So those are the conversations that have actually assisted us to say cities have a role to play, and the safer cities as an approach has been actually accepted, and the national commissioner of police has actually taken a step forward to say, let's see this model and how do we replicate it using the model that we have in the cities. So about 10 cities have been identified to model this safer city approach, and which I believe that through this particular process, we will at the end be able to get the support that is required to ensure that there is one repository for safety indicators, and there is one system as to how then do we promote the safety within the various units, departments, as well as stakeholders. So we are establishing a city safety lab as a city, which is going to bring about all these stakeholders, and these measures are going to be taken forward through that particular process. So it's a journey. It's not that it is actually, yes, we are complete in this, but we are working towards that particular process.
I really appreciate those words, that it is a journey, and actually the process is very much clearly seen in both your cities, Joburg and Durban. The 3 steps forward, 2 steps backward, 1 step forward, 4 steps backwards, but you keep going. And I think there is incremental growth in terms of the way the narrative is unfolding. Now we're talking about transversality as one of the key blockages of how we see childhood experiences in cities and how we actually deliver safety. And I think as we grapple with this big problem that faces the implementation of safety today, the transversality, how we move beyond the silos, I think this is where the central repository that Nazira has spoken to comes to bear. And one of the key value adds that the Urban Safety Monitor is seeking to try to bear on cities, to really focus on that transversality. But as well, one aspect I have not really heard both of you mention is across local government administration terms. There's a lot of good work that has been done in both cities, and particularly in the leadership era of certain mayors. And then when change happens, then you find some problematics in the implementation of that long-term strategy. How are you grappling with this, and how is this going forward, particularly when we have these visions that are talking to 2030 and 2040? How do these initiatives just die? And if they do, what do we need to do about them? How do we solve this problem?
And if I may respond to that, I think the efforts that are being undertaken by the USRG in ensuring that there is a lobbying that happens in terms of how this, the various interventions that have been identified through the various strategies are implemented at the city level. They do not rather die at the end of a term of an administration, but they rather continue. That process being undertaken by the USRG, I think it's going to give us a sense of comfort, in the sense that it should be understood generally that if the project has been adopted, it needs to be implemented, whether there is a new administration or there is a change of administration or there is one person that has left, but you follow that particular strategy to its finality. I know that because it has been a serious challenge with the city itself, say that we have a long-term development framework, which is a 2030, which was a 2030, but it moved to 2060 as a long-term development strategy. But you find that with the change of leadership and with the change of administration within that various context, there is no follow through in terms of how this long-term development framework is being measured, is being undertaken, and what is it that has not been done within that particular strategy, so that by that time it reaches the 2060, it has been achieved. So those issues have been raised in a number of platforms, and now that we are working on the safety element as one of the pillars of that long-term strategy through the USRG, I'm sure we will be able to navigate that particular process. I don't know whether Nazira would agree with me on that one.
And I think there is a focus now on engaging directly with sort of leadership around measuring safety in a broader context. But I think the question that you're asking, Juma, is an important question, because I think that as long as you have 5-year terms, the priorities will always shift in terms of where safety is being focused upon. So I think the key question then is, how do we embed and institutionalize some of the good practices that we've already engaged with at city level, so that they, even if the priorities shift, some of the processes remain. And I think that's an important conversation, and how do we do that through sort of, I suppose, more institutional conversations about not changing the focus, but maybe you can change a priority, but how you do things must begin to get more and more embedded in how the institution carries out its work. So very simple example is, if you're looking at things like road safety, the priorities can shift depending on what the data is saying, but the way you engage with different departments and different processes, those should be better embedded, more institutionalized, so that the same people who are working on these things are working together and they're not different processes. So these are some of, I think, the internal challenges that we do face, is that people also shift, champions shift, priorities shift. But in an interesting way, the projects always come full circle, because where you started, the processes always come back to the initial way in which you want to embed some of the work that people are doing. So it is, as you said, it's a iterative process. We come back and forth, but as long as we, I think, don't talk about how the institutions need to begin focusing differently and prioritizing differently, we're always going to, I suppose, move backwards and forwards on how we do any project at city level.
Very well. And I think we've done quite an excellent job in trying to really grapple with the local government institutional challenges in as far as children are concerned and children's safety is concerned. It's important that we understand this nuts and bolts, around what really are the blockages to the delivery of safety and child safety on the ground. But having said so, this session is really about children as urban citizens. And we know very well that children's learning, or rather children learn active and responsible citizenship through opportunities to practice it. So the benefits of involving children in the planning and management of these processes that you have spoken to is quite key, as they learn the formal skills of democracy and of engaging the wider community, contributing, as you rightfully put it, their creativity, their insights and thoughts to this. One question I want to really pose before I move to the next is, how do you ensure effective children's participation in your local government development plans around child safety? And how do you do that? In their schools, as you spoke to, a lot of changes are happening in the school environment today in the face of even more serious types of crimes. We see children, schools moving away from just being what I call cathedrals of learning to one that is fortressed with hard targeted environments, which is not really common. We have seen also the way children are taken as a homogeneous entity. There's no differentiation of children as they experience a city, the slum child, the township child, the street child, the child who is in child labor. a lot of these have very specific needs and requirements. How are they engaged? How are they meaningfully involved in these planning processes? Are there any innovations in either Joburg and Durban that you could relate, or you can relate to us?
Okay. In Durban, thanks, Juma, for that. I think in Durban, we, as I've indicated, that we have a unit within the city that talks to the issues of children in particular as one group of vulnerable community. So within that perspective, they are engaging with children on the basis of information sharing. They are engaging children on the basis of planning, and they are engaging children in terms of issues around the play part. So there is a forum, it's called the Children's Forum, that has been established by this particular unit, and the engagement is taking is taken within that particular space. Over and above that, through the community-based planning, initiatives that are coming out of the engagement that has happened between children or among children are also taken into consideration during that particular process. But over and above that, they also work together with our unit cities on the school safety committees, and those interventions around that programs and projects are integrated into the community-based plan, and then they move to the IDP. So that's how the engagement of children happens within the city. So there is a platform that is available, but over and above that, we are actually now entering into a memorandum of understanding with the children, South Africa, and that is going to also assist the city in ensuring that that engagement with children is open and flexible, in the sense that it's not only government, but it's also government with other sectors. That's ensuring that everybody and all stakeholders involved with the children message are considered and are involved.
Great. Any additional idea, Nazira, before I can go to the next presenter?
Yeah, Juma, from Joburg's side, I know Ayenda's coming on later. They've been doing some very interesting work around park safety and including children in the design of parks and activities. So maybe she'll speak to that in a better way.
Very well. So we're really here emphasizing on the lived experience of children in cities, the lived experience of safety in the city. And perhaps at this juncture, I would like to turn to Dr. Barbara Holzman, who has been quite a lot engaged in getting local governments to see the systemic way of delivering safety. And maybe, Barbara, you could provide us some insights, maybe propose a process that we might use based on what Nazira and I know Musa have quite ably indicated. How do we really develop a process that might use to develop indicators or to integrate indicators that reflect the lived experience of safety in the city, ones that are practical and that can be measured? Barbara.
Thanks so much, Juma and Namusa and Nazira. I think for me, this is a real passion to try and find a way to get this right. If we look at the way that indicators, at the kinds of indicators that have been adopted by cities over time, then we need to understand that initially, when Gemma, you first started with safer cities, the only form of indicators that were really there and that were and where cities invested in them was in the reduction of crime and violence. And that today is still something that is easier to get buy-in for in terms of real indicators of an improvement in security, or in other words, again, as Nazira said, trying to measure less of something. And in particular, those would be crime statistics that relate to violent crimes, that deliver hard data in the form of crime statistics. Then we kind of moved to, from that purely security-based perspective, we kind of moved towards an inclusion of things that look at crime prevention, and in particular, social crime prevention and crime prevention through urban design and management and the design of public places. But once again, we're looking at prevention. We're making the assumption that to be safer, we have to have people do less of something. We have to have people whose behavior we shift, either through the intervention of designing places differently, or of offering interventions, offering programs that offer people alternatives to violence. And I think that our big challenge in terms of looking at the safety of children is in fact to shift away from that and to say, what is it, what do we get as indicators if we look at the approach that we heard more of this morning in terms of the Play Africa, Trinity Session and Mimosa and Reggio Emilia approaches, where we look at the issues of what do we want people to do more of, and what do we want children to do more of? What experiences do we want children to have more of? Not because we think that if they don't have those experiences, they will commit crime, but if they do have those experiences, they will be what? What will be the outcome of those experiences? And I think to a large extent for me, that's about saying that what they will be more of is, and I think it was Heather who said it earlier, who said that children will be good citizens. And so if we look at the intersection between children living their best lives and safety, what do we find there? What are the nuggets that we need to be investing in at that point to be able to say, fine, if we measure this, then we will see an increase in safety, as opposed to a reduction of either crime or violence or antisocial behavior. So I think this is not an easy process, but today represents a really amazing opportunity to explore that little piece of synergy where you take what we aim to do for children when we're not thinking about safety. What do we give them? How do we invest in them? And then you take the Safer Cities approach and you try and find that little intersection and say, we want to measure that intersection. We want to find a measure that satisfies both the need for data, for the generation of hard data, but also where we learn from the experiences of children about what's possible in childhood. I love the fact that earlier Namusa mentioned children being happy. Is there a link for us that we can find between happiness and safety in our society? Is it possible to be safe when you're unhappy? Is it possible for children to grow up and contribute to a safe society? Are they going to do that more if they have a happy childhood? So I know that in South Africa specifically, many of our children, we started that with patients this morning in that conversation about children who struggle to be citizens simply because their parents are not citizens, children who don't have access to services, children who are not documented and therefore don't have access to any of the benefits that we see in the second session today, when we're looking at Play Africa, when we're looking at the way that children's play contributes to their experience as citizens in our society. Heather made the point that children are natural researchers. So if we look at what is sparked by the curiosity of children, how do we encourage them to research ways in which they can be safer? And how do we use that and turn it into data that is useful? So I think in practical terms, it really is about opening this discussion to a setting in which we contemplate always the other side of the coin. If we look at the historical measure of safety and security being crime and violence statistics, then we need to say, what is the status of law enforcement today? And how can we measure the safety of children by looking at that traditional perspective? I think we have all seen, and once again, it's been something that's been highly amplified by the pandemic. We have all seen that it's very hard to trust our police with ourselves, let alone with our children. The notion that I think has came from the British originally, of the Bobby on the beat, someone who was there to oversee children's safety, to participate in children's experiences, to be there to answer questions, to guide children, to help them not get lost, to help them be safe in the city. That perspective has gone for a long time. I don't think any of us would particularly, I'm not even sure that people today even encourage children to engage with police. And certainly from the way that we have seen police dealing with particularly people in marginalized and poor communities over the last 6 months, I think there are a lot of questions to be raised about that. And how do we shift perhaps into a situation where instead of measuring police performance in terms of crime statistics, we measure police performance in terms of their behavior towards, for instance, children. And to do that, we would need to build the capacity of the police to understand their role vis-a-vis children, and to be able to, for us to trust the police with our children. So I think that would be a very important piece. Then to look at the way that children are encouraged to speak out, the way that when it is safe for children to speak out and when it isn't, how we create safe environments for children to be able to express their fears and vulnerabilities, and the way in which cities can respond to that by making, by creating safe avenues for children. In South Africa, we've had the concept of youth desks for many years in police stations. But once again, are these actually things that make children any safer? Can children truly speak out when they are anxious or fearful about things that are happening to them? Nomfundo's discussion this morning about trauma in children was heartbreaking. And yet we know it's true. We know that children suffer extreme trauma in many circumstances, and that there are very few, and that, as Nomfundo said, we are all exhausted. We are all worn out by trauma and anxiety. And so it's very difficult for us to separate our own trauma and experience from the experience of the children with whom we interact. So I've had a terrible sinusitis this last week. So I think it's very important for us to be able to say that creating safe avenues for children to explore, to interrogate, to investigate their own circumstances, and then to be able to speak to those experiences and to share with us what makes them feel safe, what makes them safe and what doesn't, and for us to listen to those things. And then I think to have more engagements like the one that we're having today, whereby people who deal with children people whose work it is to gather information from children and who are exposed all the time to children should have more of a say in the way in which we measure children's safety. So for me, a very inspiring thing that happened in the run up to this was to have a conversation with Jesus R, who I think is somebody that I want to introduce now into this conversation before we open the floor to more general conversation, because the work that he does has really taken him on a journey that I think gives him incredible insights into the way in which children are or are not safe. And I'd really like to introduce him to you now. Jesus, I hope you're there. Jesus?
Yes, can you guys see me?
Yes, hi, welcome. Jesus,
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here.
Sorry?
It's a pleasure to be here. Good afternoon, everyone.
Hi. So Jesus, I'd really like you to just give us an introduction to how you do the work that you do and what motivated you to do it.
Sure. I think what motivated me is the fact that I'm a victim of the circumstances. When I was 22 years old, I was shot at 22 times, and facing a near-death experience tends to have an impact on your life. And for me, it was impact for good. It could have been an impact for worse, because when you grow up in a certain environment and you're kind of programmed and conditioned to certain things happening, you react to it in a much more negative way. I started a program. First, I did a show called Eye on It, and then I started a program called Guns for Cameras, to take guns off the streets and give video cameras. And I think when you're able to change that tool, you were saying earlier that if a person is not doing violence and they have the opportunity to do something else, we wouldn't know what they would be able to do, and could that be indicating factor? And for me, it absolutely is, because once you change the tool, it does 4 different things. One is there's direct empowerment, that person feels empowered, that through creating art, they're able to express themselves in a whole different way. It gives them a career, gives them the opportunity to do something different. Me picking up a camera, it changed my entire life. The second thing it does is it creates peer opportunities, because in the streets, in the environment I grew up in, it's not just what you do, it's who you affect. There's these peer groups. So if I have an opportunity to do something positive, or a young person has a camera instead of a gun, not only are they able to create things, but them being able to film allows them to excel and propel the careers of their friends in different areas, if they're able to create videos for them, if they're doing a music video, or if their friend is doing a fashion line. So the peer opportunities start to grow. The other byproduct of it is it changes the narrative, as in the long run, when these young filmmakers are able to go into studios and news networks and become bigger producers and directors, and they're able to start to create content that redefines the way that they're looked at in media. And last and not least is the cultural shift. So in 2005, I started Guns for Cameras, to take guns off the street and give kids video cameras and get them into production. Fast forward 15 years later, now everybody's a content creator. Everybody has a phone with 4K video on it, and there isn't such a disconnect between technology and the streets. And the cultural shift that's happening now, I started the SICK Film School last year, because now I have a bigger focus on the type of content that we're creating, because it's not just making a young person a filmmaker, but it's empowering us to have the voice in society to change the narrative that then influences the culture. Because a bigger part of the problem, when it comes to gun violence, it's very simple. It's supply and demand. Everybody's focused on gun laws, and there's a stalemate in lobbying, that you have the NRA on one side or the Brady campaign on the other side, and people are arguing over what they need to fix. But the bigger part of the issue is the demand, we're so focused on the supply of it and who gets to and who has access, but the demand is the bigger issue, right? In America, we've been romanticizing gun violence for over 200 years, and it doesn't just come to the hip hop community or the urban culture. Like, gun violence is prevalent in, from Italian mafia movies to Bugs Bunny cartoons to Rambo to, like, you name it. This is a part of our culture that we've created, this demand for violence. So when a young kid in the street doesn't have a lot of opportunities or outlets, or there's systematic oppression, you know, it's an easy avenue to go towards. So I think we need to focus more on the messaging and media that we're creating in mass culture that influences us, in addition to those opportunities that we're given directly that impacts the life on a very personal level.
So Jesus, I mean, that for me is really fascinating, that kind of the immediate intervention that changes the experience of children and makes them think of their lives in a different way and gives them capacity and agency to do something different. But for me, what really inspires is that next level that says, now we have something new that we can measure, which is the shift in the narrative, and that shift comes from the children themselves or the young people themselves, that we can start to ask for different things, that as children, we can think about safety instead of thinking about security. We can think about the impact of media. We can think about what we see, what we hear, who we engage with on a daily basis. And I think for me, there's a real kernel of knowledge in that says, this is something we should be engaging with much more, that maybe because we have that shift from a shift in our society where there is so much violence, where there is, and we often find in our work such a low expectation from children, from young people, of what they can expect from their environment in terms of safety. And so for me, that issue of using storytelling and shifting the narrative is such an important part of creating bigger landscapes, bigger dreams for children. Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. When you say we have so much, you know, low expectations for them, they have low expectations for themselves. Like film, the arts in general defines culturally how we see ourselves and how we see each other. So for a young kid, if he's hearing messaging and music every day, that if from whatever environment he comes from, that it's cool to be a gangster and it's cool to sell drugs and it's, you know, all these things are cool. And then a young woman is thinking, you know, one of the biggest icons in America now is, you know, it's okay to have a career as a stripper. Like, this changes our social norms. This changes what we, you know, expect to become our realities. Even with, you know, social media now, like I think, you know, that's a gift and a curse, because there's great opportunity in how we're able to share knowledge, but then there's just so much misinformation, and there's so much, it just becomes another vehicle of influence, that when you have all this content on there that with like negativity spreads faster than positivity. So I think we have to be better stewards of the content that we're creating. We have to give more opportunity to youth who are creating content, a pipeline to focus on social impact content, because it's challenging. Even in making this film Suicide Saint, it's, you know, amazing to have the acknowledgement from the UN Habitat and be involved with the Safer Cities program. We had our presentation on Saturday. Thank you again, Juma, for joining us. And we had an amazing conversation with Tamika Mallory, who's one of the most influential women in the world right now, who's the head of Until Freedom and leading all the protests in the US for the behalf of Breonna Taylor. We also had a conversation with Kevin Hines, who is a survivor of suicide. You know, mental health is a big issue right now. He survived jumping off the Golden Gate Bridge. But, you know, he took his pain and he turned it into a story, because not only did he overcome it and survive that, now he's a champion of what he was a victim of. And I think that's really important. The same way that I was impacted by gun violence, and now, you know, it's a cause that I'm trying to figure out how to solve that for other people. We need to empower the people who are the biggest victims of these circumstances to, you know, make those changes and not only save themselves, but save others, because they can speak to the sensibilities of what other people are going through.
So I want to throw the conversation open more widely, but I'd really like to have Namusa and Nazira and Juma come back in, if you would, and then throw the question out. What kinds of, how do we use this kind of inspiration to ensure that when we set indicators for the safety of children, we include that infinite capacity that children have for love and joy and positivity, and that we don't restrict it just to the less of, or the kind of bare minimum. How do we aim for something much bigger when we talk about the safety of children? And yeah, if there are people in other participants who would like to add, please do. Please, let's come in. Juma, I'm going to hand over back to you to please moderate this conversation.
Well, I think just to start with your question is very much linked also with what Stephanie Mills raises in the chat, asking the metros that are leading this process, how do you ensure the buy-in with at the three spheres of government, and what kind of support would be required to embed this into the existing broader tools that municipalities implement, the IDPs and the SDFs? I think this is just the beginning of a conversation then of how safety as a narrative is actually broadened and then implemented in a more integrated way. Perhaps to Nazira and Namusa, how do you see this with the three spheres of government, and listening into what Barbara and Jesus have quite succinctly spoken to, really the heartbeat of the lived experiences of safety? How do we do this? Because this is where we need to lift off and scale up. We need to really impact on that neighborhood, that space, that place, that engagement of the child, as I think Louise also says, to speak out, to have an avenue to speak out even more emphatically. How do we do that with the strategies that the municipality has in place today, and how it also leverages on the other spheres of government to make the child become the center of this conversation in the neighborhoods across the city?
Thanks, Juma. I think some of the sort of initiatives are beginning to think creatively about, I guess, including, you know, the youth, maybe not children in particular. But I think today's conversation really opens up the opportunities for ways in which to think differently. I think about what we also see as creating indicators inside. So the interesting exercise for this particular discussion was really tapping into what other city departments were doing around child safety. And we're obviously seeing glaring gaps in the focus and the conversations that we've been having. So I think that the sort of first step is to begin to also think now as cities, and particularly in Johannesburg, we'll think about different ways, I think, about having the conversation about including this notion of child safety in a different way into what we see as indicators as well. But I think as long as we, you know, the challenge with having a conversation around safety is I think we also get stuck into the mind frame, particularly if you're looking at how, I guess, institutional sort of environments work. Safety is always relegated to a policing focus. It's the idea that, as Barbara was sort of alluding to, is how do we reduce crime? How do we do, you know, things that are going to catch criminals? And so the whole conversation, even across I think, government departments is to really open up the notion that safety is not just about criminality and reducing crime and catching criminals, but the conversation is about which other leverage points do we have across the spheres to actually embed this notion of safety. So in the conversations that we have at local level, you'll always find departments saying, oh, that's a safety focus, speak to public safety, for example. And so you begin to kind of silo the thinking about safety itself. And it's very hard to convince people differently that actually, you know, it's not public safety is going to resolve this issue. It's another department that's going to come in. So we have to change the conversation about safety as well across the way government departments look at safety. And I think with children's safety, there is a lot of, I think, focus more on issues around social welfare issues. And so perhaps that shift also needs to happen, is how we're going to talk about child safety that is not just linked to this notion of vulnerability. But I think the conversations we're having today is how do we actually build cities and how do we build environments around children and how do we actually make them part of the bigger whole. And so I think children also see safety differently. I think their notions of safety is not an adult's notion of safety. So they'll cross a road without thinking about the dangers. And so how do we also think about how children see safety? What is their perceptions of safety? How do they experience safety? So these are some things that I think the conversations are opening up. And I think in the city like Johannesburg, I'm just thinking about the project that Jesus has just spoken about. Where my office is, we've got an area called Westbury, and it's sort of an area where youth and gun violence is very prominent. And so having a conversation like this is how can we actually start engaging the youth in thinking about safety in a more sort of creative way. We can start your project here, Jesus, with your help and partner with approaches that you've been taking. So yeah, that's sort of, I'm not answering the question directly, but I think it's not about what we're doing, it's about how we can do things differently and better.
Okay, thanks, Barbara, and thanks, Juma. I think more what we need to focus on in terms of the cities and that understanding of safety and the actual conversation of taking away the element of criminality and using the element of safety. It's one conversation that we need to take forward within internally and externally, because each time you speak about the issues of safety, as Nazira had said, the focus just changed. It's a policing matter. So, but what is expected from all the stakeholders concerned, in particular the government, and the language is one factor that we need to focus on. The language that we are currently getting into the minds of most people through our own way of thinking and acting is that we are mainly dealing with issues of criminality. And if we are talking about criminality, then we are actually not talking about safety. Safety is an unknown area within the context of within the government context. If our indicators at the beginning, in the past decades, we're talking about reducing the levels of crime, and when we are talking about a safety indicator without referring to the criminality, we are not actually responding to what people seem to understand as safety. So basically, I think what we need to do is to change the conversation and the language that we need to pursue and take forward. If we are taking safety as a matter of conversation, then other people who are not within the policing environment will see value in engaging, rather than when you're talking about the crime, the levels of crime as our indicators. I've observed this through the program that we are hosting of the homelessness, that when we were engaging our partners, our stakeholders, when we're talking about homelessness, people tend to gravitate towards helping. However, when we're starting to talk about people that are using drugs who are homeless, people tend now to say, oh, okay, now you are talking about criminals. So those are the nature of the conversation that we need to think of. And we have seen that when we are busy talking about homelessness, people were actually engaging more and more. And through that particular program, they were able to change it in their mindset and the thinking and what they were believing before. As the people who are homeless are the people that are actually promoting or perpetuating criminality in their spaces. Now the language has changed. Everyone now wants to see homeless people being assisted rather than homeless people being removed. So it's a matter of the language that I think is important, and how then do we take that language to all the levels so that we understand safety as within the context of safety. And what is good with the program that we are experimenting with the National Commissioner is that in terms of the deliverables that we are talking about, we were concerned in terms of the language that they were using initially when we were looking at the deliverables and the indicators linked to that, was that their language was talking to improving levels of crime. And we were actually concerned, because if we are an outcomes based and looking at the outcomes, the better outcomes, how then would you say you are improving the levels of crime when in fact you are saying you want to reduce the levels of crime? So those are it's a language that is actually going to assist us to turn around the understanding that the people have about the issues of safety. And if we are always talking about the negative, which is criminality, people will not gravitate towards that particular program or project. And I've seen that when we were bringing in these other departments like sports and recreation, we said, sports and recreation, please provide us with your programs that are going to assist people that are living in shelters currently due to COVID, so that they do not find themselves idling and see the time that they are spending in the shelters as waste. So that when we do that, then people will see the value of bringing their programs. But we are not saying, please bring the program to this center so that people will stop acting criminally. So those are the conversations that we have, and we have seen the value in terms of the language that we have used versus the language that we would have used, and actually alienating people and say, this is not our responsibility. You need to look for the police to assist in that. So that is that is how I'm looking at it. But it might not be in the position right now to give us the correct indicators that we want to see. But I think we need to be as creative as possible when we come up with these indicators. The indicators that are going to ensure that there is an impact, a social impact that is seen and is valued by most people, rather than the indicator whereby people, because people do not relate to the number of incidents of crime that happen. It actually shuns them. It motivates, it discourages, and it actually makes them more fearful of the spaces, rather than when you're talking about things that are positive that have happened, that have actually contributed to the lower level of crime and violence. Thank you.
Thank you, Nomusa and Nazira, for those contributions. I just wanted to say, just in response to what you just said, Nomusa, you can tell people that they're safer 1,000,000 times by demonstrating it with statistics, but until they feel safer, they're not. And I think that's something that is really important in terms of that shift in language. Thank you. Over to you, Juma, to wrap up.
Okay, very well. This is really productive. In fact, I may dare say that as we move towards the development of the Urban Safety Monitor and an expert group meeting that the City of Madrid is hosting on the 26th to the 28th, perhaps this type of conversation that's happened between Durban and Joburg should find a way into the very onset, just to see how municipalities are relating with these indicators with that institutional aspect, and then zoom into a very specific thematic issue like this. I think maybe together with Nazira, yourself, and Nomusa and Barbara, we perhaps can think about how to make that South African story much more a key illustration, and maybe with Stephanie also from the national framing. Having said that, we have a joint programming with Plan International that's about safer cities for girls. And one of the key aspects which we sort of grappled with was to think about how we influence change and how we empower community anchors like Jesus and groups like this on the ground that can actually make the difference to children, getting them to speak out using means like storytelling, etc. So we have divided our sort of theory of change into 3 main dimensions as it relates to girls in particular, but it can be extended to the whole children's agenda. One is the influence of the policy of Nazira, Nomusa, and as well other spheres of government to make those, to improve the policy and the consistency and quality of policy and programming in as far as making the children's safety agenda much more impacting on the ground. The second one is to influence, is to have civil society actors come in to influence families and communities to promote a supportive social environment that promotes the safety of children and inclusion. And then the third level is to really engage directly with the girls and the boys to be active citizens and agents of change by building their capacities and strengthening their assets and creating opportunities for meaningful participation. I believe these 3 levels are working very well in the tested cities, 5 cities across the world. And it may be something that you want to interrogate and see if it can actually fit as dimensions that can enable this local governance or safety framework to deliver the child safety agenda. And then finally, I would like to also talk to the process of developing this safety monitor. As we speak, we are heading for an expert group meeting, which will basically be producing fast the prototyped methodology from a long list of indicators to a shorter list of indicators, grappling through these narrative concepts. Are we talking about crime prevention, violence prevention? Are we talking about the broader safety shift? And then what exactly are the dimensions that we now concretely put in place to describe what this safety narrative is? And doing this in a consultative and partnership development-driven way. Then from there, we will proceed to field testing of this methodology. And there will be about 15 to 20 cities that will be enlisted for field trials. I hope Durban and Joburg will certainly be one of those field trial areas, given the wealth of knowledge you already have. And I think as hearing Nazira speak about the safety index that is being put together in Joburg, perhaps that is the liftoff that really needs to be to really take this to the next level and also try to address the problem of the central repository. And then after that, we will then be producing the reports for cities that speak to not only the incidences, as we know, the technocratic speak about the indicators, but we come to speak to the outcomes, but also the types of leveraging resources that are being put in place by communities, by the municipalities, incrementally, year in, year out. And that also feeds into the 2030 agenda call for local voluntary reviews. We could also then ensure that there are virtual platforms that enable us to see this documented evidence of cities like Joburg with its platform, with cities like Durban with its virtual platform, which we may be calling the laboratories, and then also at a global level where these 10 to 15 cities can also show the same. And that's ultimately when we start now talking about how the monitor rewards practice. And this is basically how we want by 2023 to see a situation where those anchors behind the tools that are really making transformation and speaking to it are actually brought to the global fore. So this is really where we're going. And just to summarize this, I hope that this event on children and as urban citizens is one that we can see and herald with the 40-day Safer Cities Challenge as a moment really to lift this off and raise the voices of children to come more onto the global spotlight during these 40 days in October. Hopefully next year during the Urban Fest of South Africa too, we can see more of this storytelling experiences of children coming to the fore on each of the Urban October days and really contribute to changing this challenge of children's safety into an opportunity for systemic transformation in cities. Without further ado, I appreciate all those who have made comments on the chat. Very useful and informative. I think we will find a way of how to engage. Please, I've also put my email there. Let's engage together with all the panelists. Let's find a way of how to make this move into a global movement and a global conversation for children's safety and children as urban citizens. Thank you very much. Unless we have any last comment from the panelists.
Just thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank
much
you.
appreciated.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
So we'll have the next session starting in 7 minutes. The last session of the day.